Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. It was around noon when I made the decision to stop at a local diner for some food. I remember telling the waitress how happy I was to finally enjoy some real food instead of typical truck stop fare while taking a bite out of my burger. Lake, Idaho, where my family had a small cabin, was a place I loved because it gave me a chance to escape from my 9-to-5 truck driving job and recharge. I was intrigued and offered him a cigarette when I overheard a gruff-looking man nearby talk about some strange incidents that had been happening recently around town. He introduced himself as Clay Bronson and cautiously leaned in closer, explaining that people had been reporting strange noises in the night and even people going missing lately. I furrowed my brow but didn't take his claims too seriously because they seemed like talk that would only resonate with paranoid conspiracy theorists. Later that day, as the sun was starting to set, I took a walk along the lakeside trail with my trusty flashlight in hand. The strange thing is that there's never any solid evidence or leads. My own father-in-law disappeared just last week, being replaced by a refreshing breeze from the water. As I turned off the path, I came upon a gory scene, a mutilated carcass near the trail's edge. From what little was left intact, I could tell it was probably a deer, but something horribly violent had happened to it. I tried not to gag at the sight and smell, and as I went on, memories of what Clay had previously mentioned began to swirl. In my head, a shadowy figure suddenly lunged at me as I struggled with the flashlight to get a better look. The figure was lean and unusually agile, unlike anything I'd ever seen before, and its skeletal face bore Solar's sunken eyes. Suddenly, faint rustling sounds began to emanate from further down the path. The darkness had set in, but that didn't stop me from squinting to see what the hell was going on. That sprang away and disappeared into the woods, leaving me trembling in terror and panicking. I frantically looked for my flashlight, which had fallen during my encounter with that terrifying creature, and as soon as I found it, I ran back toward town for assistance. Gasping for air and drenched in sweat, I rushed through the first door and found a small pub where Clay was drinking a beer between ragged breaths. I was surprised to learn that Clay's expression remained the same. He stared at his drink and muttered, "You've seen him too, the raker." Over the next few days, Clay and a group of locals took up arms and searched the woods for any evidence of the creature they thought was responsible for the town had experienced violence and disappearances. But by chance, or rather misfortune, we discovered its grim lair, a dilapidated shack buried deep in the woods. The stench of decay was overpowering, and as we dug through the rubble, we discovered a number of horrifying items, including bloody clothing torn from mutilated corpses, and a collection of human remains meticulously arranged, like some morbid form of art. Without weapons in hand, the residents of the town decided to never discuss these horrific findings. We all burned down the terrifying shack in the hopes of finding answers, or at least closure for everyone who had been taken from us, but our efforts were in vain, and the bloodshed went on. It seemed as though the raker was making fun of our futile attempts to discover who he really was. The remaining residents of the town took matters into their own hands and began to gather information about potential locations where the terrifying creature known as the raker could be hiding in plain sight. One such location was an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. As the body count steadily rose, we were left with nothing to do but watch in horror as the darkness surrounding Dragon Lake devoured us one by one. On a chilly Tuesday night, We assembled in small groups and stormed through the warehouse in the hopes of finding the monster and putting an end to the carnage. As we got closer, I noticed that everything was eerily quiet. Even the winds seemed to have stopped blowing. We were hesitant but determined, and we entered the building with weapons in hand. Inside, we discovered more gory evidence of the rakers' twisted activities, including the personal belongings of those who had gone missing, restroom, and walls covered in dried blood. We knew we were getting closer to locating this beast and ending this ordeal. After hours of searching, our perseverance paid off when we discovered a box in a small room at the back of the warehouse that contained old newspaper clippings and journal entries written by a local man, Hank Corrigan, declared missing more than 2 years ago. The records showed that prior to his abrupt disappearance, Hank had engaged in a lot of occult activities in an effort to call forth a strong demonic creature known as the Raker. Little did he know at the time, but his disturbing obsession ultimately caused him to become the host of this vicious creature from another world, which caused him to, in order to expel the Raker from Hank's earthly form, we prepared a ritual by setting up a large circle of salt in the middle of the warehouse with candles in each cardinal direction. Armed with this knowledge, it became evident what needed to be done. We needed to cut Hank's connection with the Raker and send this evil being back from whence it came. We did this by following the instructions in his journal entries as we recited the incantation withheld from Hank's journal. An unearthly coldness filled the warehouse. At that moment, the condemned door at the far end of the room exploded with force, and the Raker emerged within inches of us. We had placed Hank's personal belongings in the center of the circle in an attempt to connect with his spirit and hopefully weaken the Raker's hold on him. The Raker's frantic movements gradually slowed. Its sunken eyes dimmed as it was clearly weakened by our efforts, and finally, with one thunderous voice, we chanted louder and more fervently as we continued our ritual against this otherworldly force. As a sinister and menacing figure lurked in the darkness, the Raker was gone, and the creature that had once been Hank Corrigan lay on the ground as life gradually returned to normal in Dragon Lake. Then, an intense burst of energy erupted from within the salt circle, erupting from our collective throats. The sudden shockwave sent us sprawling across the floor, but we had done it. There will always be forces lurking in the shadows that threaten to destroy even our strongest sense of security. But as I sit here today reflecting on those horrific events and remembering those who perished at the Raker's ruthless hands, we vowed never to forget those who were lost and to never take for granted the peace and safety that had returned to our town. As I sipped my coffee at the truck stop diner, I thought about the absurd fuel prices of this desolate location, even out here in remote Oige County, and I couldn't help but feel hopeful that we might be able to endure even the darkest of times together, thanks to everyone who stood with me in our fight against darkness itself. My name is Darius Caldicott, and I have been driving long-haul rigs for about 20 years. I can say that it's not for everyone, but it suits me just fine. My caffeine hiatus was short-lived, though, when Freddie Delgadillo, a fellow trucker and colleague of mine, walked in looking for, I noticed that Freddie was a little tense. He's not the kind of person who gets easily shaken. He has survived storms, avoided criminals on the highway, and even had a few run-ins with the law. He gave me a half-hearted greeting as he came to my booth, saying, "We've got a problem outside." I asked, perplexed by his attitude, and he hesitated before answering. "What do you mean?" It was more horrifying than you could have imagined. Man the size of Benny lay slumped against the side of his rig, his leg mangled and twisted beyond recognition. Blood covered the concrete beneath him. Benny Hayes has been hurt really badly next to his truck. Out of pure instinct, we both ran towards Benny's truck, making our way through the rows of parked rigs. Freddie and I were desperately looking for something to help Benny as it created a menacing pool that was barely visible under the dim light of low-lying fog and twilight hours. At the same time that other drivers began to swarm to evaluate the chaos, Jesus Christ, someone whispered from behind us as they caught a glimpse of Benny's condition in the distance. A flicker of movement caught my eye, but I couldn't quite make out as I struggled to identify what it was, or who it was. The figure abruptly vanished from view. We immediately called an ambulance, and, after what seemed like an eternity, they arrived prepared to take Benny to the closest hospital. As the Ents wheeled him away, he managed to find a makeshift tourniquet for his leg, to take hold of my arm and say something about Sweet Molly, leaving me perplexed and bewildered after the overwhelming events of that night. I went to the bar, next to the diner with Freddie and a few other truckers, for a stiff drink in an attempt to make sense of this unexplainable incident. Sweetheart Molly was Benny's wife. Freddie slurred as he finished his fifth whiskey. Some freak accident happened a few years ago. As the pieces began to fit together, linking Benny's ramblings with that indistinguishable figure in pink earlier, I gulped down my beer. I realized something oddly unsettling had happened. A supernatural force appeared determined to seriously harm our ranks, and whether it was a sinister appearance or not, it was now known among us that anyone who happened to cross paths with Sweet Molly would either share Benny's fate or perhaps the following days were tense, as if all the truckers were waiting for the other shoe to drop. We all stuck together whenever possible for safety, and as we exchanged stories, we looked for potential explanations for her appearance or intentions, but none were discovered, only making us more paranoid and uneasy with each second that went by. Our nerves were frayed one day, but I couldn't get the image of that pink-haired figure out of my head. How could she be connected to Sweet Molly? How could she be connected to all these events? That's when I decided to look further. S didn't jump at the slightest noise or constantly look over their shoulder. I looked everywhere for information about Molly's past, including public records, old newspaper clippings, and even Benny's possessions that were kept in the diner. Eventually, I came upon a newspaper article from a few years ago about a truck accident that involved Benny Hayes and his wife Molly. According to the article, they were driving together when Benny lost control of his rig and careered into a bridge support column. The truck burst into flames upon impact. The more I read about the terrible accident, the more I wondered why Molly had died instantly in the passenger seat, while Benny had miraculously survived with only minor injuries. Was there something sinister going on? At that point, I started to inquire about them both and learned the disturbing fact that Molly had not died alone in that crash. After all, I discovered through locals who had known her personally that Molly had been pregnant when she passed away. It turns out that she had dyed her hair bubblegum pink at the time, which is now hard to overlook given her relationship to our enigmatic shadow dweller, who had been lurking around. Perhaps by some twisted stroke of fate, Sweet Molly, or her unborn child, had returned as this spectral presence determined to exact revenge for their premature death. It seemed reasonable that the expectant Molly might blame the truckers for her passing, especially since Benny was their poster boy. The haunting memories of everyone impacted became more vivid as they heard creaks in the wrong spot and saw a spooky figure whose presence was unquestionably ominous, until Benny eventually woke up from he told me about the vengeful spirit that was haunting him and other truckers in his dreams while in a coma. I made the decision to call a meeting with the truckers who were haunted by Sweet Molly and talk to them about ways to placate her vengeful spirit. We came to the conclusion that we needed closure, an admission of guilt from Benny, and an apology from Molly's false memory. A few days later, we gathered with his bowel in hand. Benny found the strength to apologize to his late wife Molly, saying, "I'm so sorry, Molly." He sobbed aloud and poured liquor onto the ground as an offering to her, saying, "I didn't mean for it all to happen. How could I have known that you were carrying our child? Please forgive me and leave us in peace." After that night, the tension felt lighter. Some people think Molly has forgiven Benny and moved on to the afterlife, while others maintain it was all collective hysteria. However, I know what I saw, whatever it was that haunted our truck. As if something had changed within us all, truckers started going back to their normal routines without being bothered by ominous fears or eerie manifestations. That figure with the bubblegum hair will always be etched deeply into our haunted hearts, and even though the uneasiness that had long since subsided, we all knew that there was a cold truth hanging in the air. Perhaps stopping those dark days would have brought relief from the burdens our world carried. It was another boring night on the road, and I was very bored. I work as an overnight truck driver for a tiny company that makes long hauls throughout the United States, and Swede Molly would always be with us, lurking, observing, and waiting for the day she could exact her retribution. The only thing is that truck stops are a great source of entertainment. You never know what or who you'll run into. One evening, as I pulled into this truck stop somewhere in Nebraska that I'd never heard of before, let's call it Last Chance Gas, everything seemed fairly normal. I've been doing this for a while, so you'd think I'd be accustomed to the monotony that comes with it, as I ate a disgustingly greasy burger at the seedy diner attached to the gas station. I couldn't help but hear a few people discussing something they'd recently seen lurking around the area. That thing had to be at least 6'6" with arms as long as tree trunks, but skinny like a twig, one guy said emphatically. It was just a random group of truckers and locals getting some shut-eye or food. Even though I find these stories fascinating, I try not to listen in too much because I don't want people to think I'm snoopy or naive. Later, when I got back to my truck and went to bed, the conversation I overheard lingered in my head as much as I laughed at their tales, because nothing had ever happened to me over these hauls, and it couldn't hurt to have my tire iron on hand, just in case. I was in the middle of a delightful dream in which Scarlett Johansson was part of me when I was startled awake by a loud noise. It was as though someone or something had slammed their fists against the side of my truck, and the entire cabin shook violently under whatever force was attacking it. My heart was racing so much that I was afraid to even look out the window. After getting over my fear, I made the decision to look into the tire iron that was clutched tightly in my hand as I got out of my truck. I carefully looked around, but I couldn't see anyone else nearby, not even the smallest outline of a person or animal. The following day, when I had my truck checked out at the gas station repair shop following the unexplained nighttime disruption, I asked around cautiously because curiosity now drives me more than fear, and Mechanic Frank, with his name tag on display, told me that over half of the fuel tanker trucks passing through had been attacked and siphoned over the past few weeks. Even worse, some drivers went missing. Loretta, a sassy waitress, told me that she saw a group of odd-looking people lurking near the I've been stopping at the edge of the truck stop every night for a few weeks now, and supposedly they had this eerie presence about them. Well, with that new knowledge in mind, guess what my stupid self did that night? I parked my truck farther away from everyone else again in the hopes of seeing those creeps Loretta mentioned. After futile hours of waiting and becoming more and more irritated at how I'm not sure what kind of adrenaline rush or sheer stupidity got me, but I was out the door before I realized what was happening. They were hunched-over figures with sickly pale skin and elongated limbs surrounding another truck station further down the lot, and they seemed to work in unison, twisted machines smashing the trunks. It was quiet, and disappointment began to creep in until that loud bang echoed through my cabin once more. I could only watch as one of them saw my paralyzed figure, its eyes black as tar and wide open, seeming to look straight into my soul. There was something uncannily human about this creature, or perhaps a person who was no longer fully human, that made it all the more horrifying. Fuel lines and siphoning the gas with alarming speed, frozen in place from whatever combination of terror and disbelief had taken over me. Or perhaps it belonged to a cult of vicious animals, and I was unable to determine how I should handle the situation. In the instant when our eyes met, one of them gestured to the others, which I could only assume meant that we had been spotted. However, before I could turn and flee, those animals moved at an abnormally high speed, and one of them was directly in front of me. obstructing my escape. My heart almost jumped out of my chest when I asked, "What do you want?" While trying to speak steadily, the creature tilted its head, examining me as though deciding what to do. To my surprise, it said, "We need the fuel our family needs." I raised an eyebrow, but I chose to play along and try. The thing hesitated before responding quietly, "We are changed. We were once like you, but were altered after coming across something we shouldn't have." It seemed sincere in its admission, which further shocked me by what I had learned. To learn more about these things, you're stealing gas from trucks to support your family. I cautiously asked. It doesn't matter, the creature sighed, but our family needs the fuel for survival. We don't mean to harm you, but we cannot stop. After learning that they didn't mean to hurt people, I felt a strange sense of empathy as each of the distorted creatures came out of the shadows to stand with their comrade. After the initial shock subsided, I concluded that my best course of action was to negotiate. The creatures looked at each other and nodded slowly, but their leader extended a long limb toward me in a gesture resembling a handshake. "We accept your terms if you don't hurt anyone here tonight or in the future, and I won't report this incident to anyone. If you need the fuel so badly for survival or for any other reason, perhaps we can work something out. Shall try not to harm." Others I reluctantly shook its hand, feeling strange relief that I'd been able to make a deal with these creatures rather than dying a horrible death. As the days passed, I made sure my new friends had fuel without drawing suspicion from the truckers or the locals, and they kept their promise that they didn't hurt anyone at the truck stop whenever I inquired about their origin, or although it was obvious that they were once humans but had changed for an unknown reason. The explanations for why they needed fuel for survival were either evasive or completely avoided. As agreed upon, I kept my end of the bargain and never reported our encounter. But weeks went by without any problems, no more gas thefts, no more missing truckers, until one day, when I returned to the truck stop for a long haul, I found that my strange friends had disappeared, as I'm still not sure who they were or what they experienced that changed them into those weird creatures. But oddly enough, no one else seemed to know or even notice their abrupt disappearance until today. Sometimes late at night, as I continue to haul cargo across this vast country, I catch myself staring out into the darkness, wondering if there are other beings like I'm a road-hardened trucker named Varden Thistleberg, and I've seen my share of them lurking just out of sight. I'm still not sure what happened to them or how they even existed, but life goes on as usual on the road, with every mile bringing new mysteries and questions as vast as America itself. It began like any other ordinary evening while trucking down I-70 through the Midwest. Of strange things on the road, but this one incident still makes me shiver. As I was drinking lukewarm coffee from my travel mug, I heard noises coming from my CB radio. It wasn't the typical trucker banter, but rather something strange and out of the ordinary. At first, I dismissed it as static and carried on driving, but my misfortune continued when blown out I was in a seemingly empty stretch of highway, when the tire suddenly forced me to pull over onto the shoulder. I grudgingly got out of the taxi, cursed my misfortune, and cracked some gallows humor about the costly truck repairs. By the time I finished changing the tire, my hands were black with rubber residue, and I was about to leave headlights approaching in the distance. My initial feelings of unease temporarily disappeared as the car approached and parked about 50 feet away from me. I was relieved that someone else might be available to help if necessary, but those feelings quickly returned when a man got out of his car and approached my truck. He appeared oddly out of place, a well-groomed man in a spotless. There was something strange about him, wearing what must have been one of the weakest smiles in human history. He was wearing a suit with an eerie, wide smile on his face, and his hair was perfectly styled, not even a gust of wind could move a strand. One evening, he called out as he walked forward in need of assistance, and his courteous greeting sent shivers up my spine. I couldn't help but feel that man had something sinister in mind, but I couldn't quite place his little joke, the idea of a well-dressed man offering roadside assistance on a desolate stretch of highways seemed almost ridiculous, and when I noticed the headlights trailing behind me, the situation took an even darker turn. He quickly replied that everything was under control and climbed back into my cab. I sped down the highway again with white knuckles on the wheel. Not far behind me, my heart pounded in my chest as I sped up in an attempt to get away from the man who was following me. When he kept up with me at every turn, it became more and more clear that he intended to hurt me. In a cruel turn of events, the menacing stranger was able to intercept my radio signal and started to cruelly taunt me with eerie laughter and cryptic messages, which gradually drove me closer to the edge of my desperation. Reached a breaking point when I radioed an old trucker friend, Clayton Burlingsworth, to tell him my story in hushed panic tones. He suggested that the man might be connected to a string of unexplained disappearances involving truckers along similar routes. As the news hit me like cold stones, the man persisted in pursuing me for a terrible while. When I finally saw a truck stop up ahead, I was filled with new hope and a sense of security in numbers. I pulled into the rest area, parked my rig among other truckers, and frantically disembarked. The car behind me screeched to a halt just as I dashed into the busy truck. By this point, his sadistic laughter had turned into nails on a chalkboard in my brain. Stop Diner pleading for assistance from anyone who would listen. Amazingly, when we all hurried outside, prepared to face this insane man who had been pursuing me all night, neither his car nor his presence were found. Clayton later told me that local law enforcement had discovered multiple missing trucks abandoned at different locations along that famous highway. And as for the icy stranger in the spotless suit, there have been rumors circulating among there is a trucking community about a man who fits that description and is connected to those missing truckers. It appears that my encounter was the most recent in a string of sinister events that go back generations. It is still unknown how he knows my exact thoughts, intercepts radio signals, and carries out his horrible deeds. But even though I still drive a truck, I decided to follow Clayton's advice and look into those missing trucker stories. After a lot of phone calls and awkward questions, I was able to speak with a few old friends who knew some local law. When faced with suspicious characters or unusual circumstances, my mind constantly fears the possibility of running into that evil man again, or worse, someone else. Quite a list of potential leads. But one name that kept coming up was Phantom Phil. Many truckers just called this unidentified man PP for short. It seemed that the odd man in the suit I had met actually had some sort of urban legend status among the trucking community. However, on the third day, following my terrifying encounter, nobody seemed to have any hard evidence of his origins or identity. One of the people I had contacted during my research called to say he had located someone who could give me crucial details about Phantom Phil's origins. Intrigued by this new lead, I set up a meeting with them at a dive bar outside of Joplin, Missouri. When I got to the joint, a grizzled old man with leathery skin and dark eyes full of mystery introduced himself as uncomfortably knowledgeable about my story. Dale Carson seemed eager to fill in some of the blanks. He led me to a quiet booth, far from pioneers, and asked, "You want to know about PP?" as he lit up a hand-rolled cigarette. His real name is Philip Matthews, or at least that's what we believe it to be. Began to take shape like a story from True Detective magazine. Philip Matthews had been employed as a hitman and enforcer for a Chicago crime family in the 1930s. He had been marked for death, according to Dale Matthews, after killing too many trusted members of his own organization and stealing their human trafficking profits. Matthews outwitted his would-be executioners and disappeared with the money. According to legend, Dale hinted that Matthews uses the essence of the truckers to fuel his prolonged existence by literally draining their life force. Matthews has been making these enigmatic appearances along the highways for decades. The idea sickened me and I struggled. Matthews had somehow found a way to prolong his life by preying on truck drivers like some nocturnal blood-sucking creature. We sat in silence for a moment as I tried to process everything Dale had told me about Phantom Phil living off human souls, but I couldn't help but think of that strange man. Dale smirked, tapped his cigarette on the ashtray, and leaned in closer, as if sensing my reaction. "You're lucky, kid, because as far as we can tell, you're the first person he's ever backed down from, who had pursued me while I was defenseless on that barren stretch of asphalt." If Dale's statement was accurate, I was genuinely enchanted by this frightening story, which linked me to generations of truck drivers who had heard those eerie whispers. In the night, after paying the bill and saying goodbye to Dale outside the bar, I took one last look around before getting back into my rig. My heart was racing in my ears as I took her with knowledge and armor. I would continue driving through mile after dreary mile, every petal falling to the ground in defiance of Phantom Phil. I took a deep breath and unlocked my truck door. The road stretched before me like a snake, winding through a desert wasteland, an endless cycle of beginnings and endings tied together by one dark myth. It was time for us truckers to take back our proper position on those desolate highways. Every gas station stop that was burning into the night was proof that we would no longer be threatened by unidentified enemies, or be pursued, taunted, or cowardly viewed by sinister smiles in our rearview mirrors. It was looking like just another dull shift on the road. Driving this piece of metal from state to the state covers the expenses and lets me laugh with my trucker friends at restaurants. But it didn't bring any excitement. Little did I know that one night, while I was traveling my usual route through the Minnesota backwoods, the sun had set hours earlier, and there was nothing but darkness for miles around. My eyes grew heavy as I looked around. I decided that I needed a pick-me-up at the next gas station after looking for any signs of life. As I pulled into the fluorescent-lit oasis, I jumped out of my cab with a yawn and an exaggerated stretch. Earl was working that night. He was a good-hearted old man with enough stories to last a lifetime. "Good evening, girl. Do you have any fresh coffee brewing?" We talked for a few minutes about sports scores and families when Sarah entered. She was cool as ice, smooth as velvet, and had this air about her that drew light. "Sure thing, Davy," he said with his contagious smile. "I just whipped up a pot for you." I filled up my thermos and took a sip of the piping hot liquid, straight black, bitter, and scalding like every battle-tested trucker's brew should be. Earl asked her how she'd been lately, and she replied, "Well, there's someone new in town who's been causing some trouble." A mischievous smile appeared on her lips as she glanced at me, and my curiosity was piqued. I pressed for more information, but Sarah scarfed and waved her hand casually before leaning back. I couldn't imagine someone like that causing trouble here. The small community dotted between the vast stretches of nothingness were fairly tame. When it came to deviance, inconspiratorially, Davy, there have been some beatings and even a slashed throat just last week. People claim to have seen him running out of Amber's trailer park earlier tonight. He was a man, or something like one, but with sickly pale skin and eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. Nevertheless, I had to acknowledge that her version of events made me uneasy. The following day, as I was driving my rig, I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's story. I laughed to myself, considering the possibility that a local vigilante was taking matters into his own hands. Suddenly, at the edge of my headlights, I spotted a figure dart across the road. Alert and tense, I cautiously pulled over. As I stepped out into the cold night air, I felt a chill go through me, not so much from fear as from the chill that starts to creep in before winter hits full force. The wind whistled a tune through the trees as I carefully made my way towards where I'd seen movement. I grabbed my flashlight to see if there was any truth to those rumors. I had to make sure that whoever was out there wasn't a threat to me in my truck as well as to the townspeople. My instincts took over, and I swung my flashlight at this stranger's head with all my strength. In response, he gave me an ear piercing howl before staggering backward and asking, "Who are you?" My blood pressure was pounding. I hadn't gone far when my flashlight flickered across the figure Sarah had described, exactly as she had described, pale skin and unsettling eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness as he turned toward me. His face had turned into a snail. I stepped back just in time to avoid being slashed across the chest. But this guy wasn't giving up, and I found myself fighting for my life as we exchanged blows, each of us willing to give ground. His breathing was labored, and then a sharp blade suddenly caught the light as he lunged at me. My heart raced as we continued our violent dance, each of us barely avoiding injury. Our breasts became heavier, and I knew it couldn't last much longer. Then, with a quick feint, I disarmed him and put my flashlight to his throat, demanding that he stop choking in between gasping breaths and start talking. "I'm Reggie, and I've lost my job. My wife left me, and as we stood there in the dim light of the moon, I could see the truth in his eyes. Reggie was a broken man, not some supernatural terror or vigilante. His anger turned to pity, so I lowered my makeshift weapon and asked, "Why do you attack people?" At first, not really meaning anything. I heard about Ambush Trailer Park and thought maybe they were dealing drugs there or something, so I thought, maybe if I scared them off, I wouldn't feel so damn powerless. As we talked more that night, I found out that Reggie had gone through so much that it had twisted him into someone he barely recognized. He confessed shame that followed his words. I couldn't bring myself to despise him or even turn him into the authorities because, deep down, I understood what it's like to feel trapped by circumstance and yearn for some sort of control. Reggie's filthy face was streaked with tears, and his eyes were clouded by desperation. I no longer recognized that the violence was his way of regaining some control over his life, a way to make himself feel less like a victim, despite everything he'd done to others in their community. I decided to help this man. I couldn't solve all of his issues, but perhaps I could give him a new beginning. "Listen, Reggie, I won't turn you in," I said firmly, "but you need help to get back on your feet." Reggie nodded enthusiastically, realizing the importance of the second chance. Over the course of the following few days, we collaborated to clean him up and locate him nearby. With every day that went by, Reggie regained his humanity and moved into an old RV outside of town. It wasn't much, but it was a lot better than what had been nighttime terror for him. After those few days with Reggie, I got back in my truck and continued my life. I worked as a janitor at one of the gas stations, a kind boss who would give a desperate man a chance. I was driving my truck on a section of Route 66 near Amber, California, when the journey was abruptly interrupted. The trees vanished behind me, and I felt a strange mixture of relief and pride swelling in my chest. Reggie's story would stay with me for the rest of my life, a testament to how our circumstances can twist us into something we're not if we don't take control of them. My rig wasn't the most fancy, but she got me from point A to point B just fine, and she had been my reliable companion for hundreds of thousands of miles. I had traveled this route many times before, and most of the time it was as boring as watching paint dry. However, on this particular journey, I had unintentionally secured a front row seat to a twisted spectacle unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was strange to think that something so everyday could finally bring me face to face with such horror. I chose to stop at Roy's Motel and Cafe, an old haunt from way back, for some lunch and fuel before continuing on. After finishing their famous burger and fries, I paid my bill and rumbled. Roy was a dependable beast that didn't ask for much, other than the occasional oil change and a new set of tires here and there. I saw an old station wagon sitting by the side of the road with its hood up a few miles later. Since I'm not one to abandon someone stranded in the scorching desert sun, I pulled over and spoke with the driver, a middle-aged man named Dale, who appeared more irritated than worried. After a little tinkering with his engine and some muttering of obscenities, Dale acknowledged he had no idea what was wrong. He asked me if I could drive him to the closest town in his car, so I said yes. As we drove down the highway, we talked about our lives on the road and our hometowns. Soon after, our conversation shifted to local events, and Dale mentioned recent reports of a string of vicious animal maulings in the area. He described how people had described horribly disfigured bodies left strewn along rural roads, as if. I started to feel very uneasy, but I couldn't help but ask him for more details. His description of the victims was frighteningly detailed, as if he had witnessed everything firsthand. He knew how long the intestines were, how much blood was soaked into the soil, and the lingering, unforgettably strong odor. At that point, Dale's tone changed. He said that locals thought the culprit was a rogue and twisted person, a former veterinarian named Dr. Brent Keeler, who had a sick fascination with pain, suffering, and death. He said this in hushed whispers, as if someone or something might overhear us through the closed windows of my truck cap. Dale explained how Dr. Keeler had disappeared years ago, leaving only a trail after obtaining a license through unethical means, which caused him to spiral even further into madness and develop an insatiable bloodlust. He would take unfortunate animals from unknown sources and subject them to hideous experiments intended only to cause suffering and destruction. Some even claimed he used human victims when the chance presented itself of mangled bodies in his wake. The local authorities conducted a thorough search, but were unable to locate him or his gory creations. Up until this point, I could feel my heart racing in my chest as we drove down our desolate desert highway. This terrifying knowledge, gripping us both, suddenly. What should have been a routine drive through what appeared to be a benign landscape became a highway. As we crested a hill on our way to hell, just as dusk was falling, we saw a lone figure standing still by the side of the road. We almost stumbled upon her, our headlights illuminating her thin, distinctive face. It was Dr. Keeler, smiling maniacally in the darkness, and Dale muttered to himself, "How could this be?" As we gaped at the figure in shock, I had a million questions about how Dr. Keeler could still be alive and lurking on this empty road. Suddenly, we felt a sense of dread, so I gripped the steering wheel tightly and kept driving. Dale whispered, urgently, clearly terrified. I hesitated for a second, then pressed the gas pedal, speeding past the menacing figure that appeared to be staring into our very souls. It was about 8:30 p.m. when we arrived at the safety of a nearby town, and Dale insisted on going straight to the police. We plucked up the courage to tell the chief investigator about our terrifying experience. He listened carefully. His face grim. He revealed that they had just discovered another mole body, and the evidence again pointed to Dr. Keeler's handiwork. Dio became nervous and looked out the window. Dale reluctantly revealed previously withheld information about Dr. Keeler's descent into depravity, including his affiliation with an underground group of like-minded individuals who perform twisted experiments in a hidden lab outside town. As if anticipating the deranged doctor would suddenly appear in our midst, the investigator noticed his agitation and urged him to disclose everything he knew about Dr. Keeler's unsettling deeds. With his mouth trembling, Dale revealed that he had been much more involved than we first thought. With bated breath, he confessed that he had been an unwilling participant in some of these horrible acts that Dr. Keeler himself had planned. Overwhelmed by guilt and seeking atonement, Dale diligently gathered evidence that would implicate Dr. Keeler and his network of sick-minded people, devotees who brought him to this fateful road not by accident, but on purpose. While the investigator sent local law enforcement officers to search the area where we came across Dr. Keeler, however, his remarkable ability to stay hidden only made us shiver. In the days that followed, authorities took action based on Dale's information and were able to capture a number of important members of the underground group. As Dale continued working with law enforcement to put an end to Keeler's sadistic operation, Dr. Keeler remained at large, seemingly always on guard, like a shadowy spectre waiting for his moment. I went back to life on the road, never knowing when or where our paths would cross again, but our final words were a promise that justice would be served eventually. Although everything that happened during those horrific days was a startling reality that still haunts me, we continued to be vigilant in the interim, knowing that evil could strike from the most unexpected corners of our world. Sometimes, even the most normal lives can collide with unfathomable darkness when we least expect it. And while Dr. Brant Keeler's name had become a byword for unimaginable horror, and there was no solace in the knowledge that he was still a threat waiting for his next chance to strike, everything was going well. I had recently landed a new job as a truck driver, and I was getting used to the long hours behind the wheel. My name is Terrell Hudson, and I'm a laid-back guy who has a soft spot for Dad. I never imagined that jokes and a regrettable fear of spiders would all come into play on one terrible night. I was driving my 18-wheeler halfway between Thorn Lake and the tiny town of Matheson, Colorado, when the sun had set and a chilling darkness had crept through the area. Classic rock songs were playing on my radio, as those local radio DJs must get bored sometimes. A few hours into the journey, my path came to an old rest stop. I kept my eyes on the road, but all of a sudden my static-filled radio became clear, and I stumbled on a local station, broadcasting an emergency warning. I couldn't quite make out what it was about danger in the area, possibly even a killer, but it sounded like a joke to me. As I entered the dimly lit rest stop building, I noticed a group of weary travelers huddled around one of those vintage coin-operated booze machines where you've heard police scanner broadcasts talking in hushed tones about missing people. The place was notorious for its awful coffee and dubious vending machine snacks, so I pulled over to face the unfortunate restroom facility that stood against this remote backdrop. People in this area of Colorado that they had previously heard about on their own radios didn't realize how uncool it was to listen in anyhow. It sounded like fairly typical fare for a spooky story made up by bored people who spend too much time on Reddit. After wasting enough time listening to other people's conversations, I stepped outside into the night air and heard muffled laughter before realizing that every truck driver parked at the rest stop was before returning to my truck. I thought, completely out of commission, some people just can't handle their alcohol. The parking lot was hardly illuminated by the eerie glow of scattered overhead lights, and the area was filled with the frigid night air. It would have been a lovely moonlit scene if it weren't for a jerk who was stumbling between the trucks up ahead, likely looking for his own ride to crash in. The stranger appeared to be in rough shape. He approached me, looking as though he had been chewed up and spat out by a week-long coke bender. I don't know anything about that life, but he seemed unaware of his surroundings, or too drunk to care. He was one of those coal miners down on his luck. His jacket was torn and ragged, bloodied at the sleeves, and at least 2 sizes too small. "Hey man, are you okay? You seem kind of lost." I caught him with a half-hearted laugh, but he didn't respond. Instead, he raised his arms as though to give me an unwanted hug. My suspicions were aroused, but then I noticed a gun concealed in his hand, and everything went wrong. I fled behind my truck, my survival instincts taking over any doubt I had before, and I heard crackling laughter all around me. When the gunfire stopped for a moment, I considered my options and decided to either run for my life or die like one of those losers who can't think their way out of a horror movie. The stranger fired shot after shot into my truck cabin, shattering the glass and causing panic to bloom inside of me, like a fire trying to consume all rational thought. I swear the madman just stood there covered in blood and laughing maniacally, an attacker devouring prey perhaps more twisted than any nightmare I could have imagined, as I ran toward the former group of gossips, now sprayed chaotically across their booth floor. He was heading away from my truck toward one of the other parked big rigs, when he stumbled upon one of those terrified strangers I'd eavesdropped on earlier. The situation in this remote rest stop had become much more sinister than I had ever imagined, and I now wondered if I would ever survive their life. I looked at the mutilated body of what had once been that unfortunate stranger, and a grotesque creature stood above the remains, its laughter blending with the maniac who was still firing shots sporadically into the night. The creature changed into a man with blood all over him, a filthy grey uniform, and a foul stench. He appeared to have crawled out of a grave, and the name Henderson was embroidered on his chest. Memories of Martin Henderson, an orderly at the now closed Matheson Asylum, came flooding back to me. I had heard tales about him years ago. As the twisted laughter persisted around me, I prayed for someone to come and rescue us from this nightmare. Then, with my heart thumping in my chest, I saw a flare gun lying close to the police scanner booth. I approached cautiously, snatched up the less than perfect weapon, and loaded one of the flares with trembling hands. Suddenly, Henderson's menacing laughter came. I aimed the flare gun at the psychotic killer and hesitated for only a second before pulling the trigger. When he realized what I had in my hand, his once amused smirk turned into a sinister grimace as he raised his handgun once more. The tension was unbearable as we locked eyes, each of us knowing that only one of us would leave this situation and skate with no time to lose. When the deafening roar and an explosion of sparks struck Henderson's insane body, he gasped in shock, went up in flames, and staggered back into the shadows, momentarily surprising the creature behind him. They vanished deeper into the darkness. I knew that my window of escape was small. With my heart beating quickly, my hands sweating, and my limbs moving more quickly than I ran toward my truck or any other vehicle that was still operational enough to get out of this hellhole. And when I finally arrived at my now bullied truck, I slammed on the gas pedal and hoped beyond belief that it would pull through this nightmare. The tractor roared to life, and in a matter of seconds, I left the horror of the rest stop behind and sped away from me as I ran away into the night. I couldn't help but wonder if Morgan Henderson and his twisted creature would find me again. However, that was a problem for another day, because for the time being, I was leaving them and their reverberating laughter in my dust in order to start a new life where monsters were only found in stories told around campfires. My name is Terrell Hudson, and this is my story. I was driving along Route 66 while listening to my favorite rock songs and taking in the scenery of the open road. Long-haul trucking wasn't for everyone, but I enjoyed the freedom and solitude. Coming to terms with why those missing person cases never got solved sometimes makes it better to not know what darkness lurks just beneath the surface of our world. It gave me the opportunity to forget about my daily concerns and concentrate only on the road ahead. Needless to say, I hadn't anticipated this trip to go as planned. It was a sweltering day in Arizona, and I was looking forward to stretching my legs, getting a snack, and talking to some people before continuing on my journey. It was a quiet place with only a few long haulers like me. As I sat there drinking coffee and listening to conversations around me, I heard some truckers talking about something that caught my attention. They were talking in hushed tones and didn't seem eager to share specifics, but they all seemed to agree that something had gone horribly wrong at a nearby warehouse last week. I couldn't help but be curious, so I started talking to a local who worked as a security guard at the warehouse. What he told me chilled me to the bone. Apparently, one night while on his regular security patrol, he discovered a mutilated body thrown near an abandoned lot close to the warehouse grounds. The victim's face was completely torn away, and although shaken, their insides were gutted, like an animal carcass. Because he didn't want to jeopardize his job by getting directly involved, he called law enforcement in secret without giving his name or any other personal information. As he went on to explain how more bodies have since started to appear in similar conditions, confirming rumors that have been whispered among despite the fact that the number of victims had increased steadily over the past few months due to a deranged serial killer on the loose. The local police were unable to make any progress on the case and were doing everything in their power to keep it quiet and avoid inciting panic among the populace. I must admit that by this time, my skepticism had given way to morbid curiosity, and I made the decision to drive by the abandoned lot where the first body was discovered. After finishing my shift and parking my truck at another truck stop along the highway, I got in a cab and asked the driver to take me to that rundown lot. As we got closer, the cabbie turned pale and gave me a look like I had gone crazy, refusing to drive any closer, telling me it was just a scary story that I would be able to laugh off later that night. Without knowing what I was talking about, I got out of the taxi and ended up in a pitch-black alley straight out of a horror film. This is where things started to get really spooky. The farther I went, the more I heard strange scratches that sounded like something gnawing on wood or scraping against metal. I pulled out my phone and put it on record, figuring that if whatever was making those sounds was after me. At least as I continued to move cautiously under flickering street lamps, with ominous shadows cast around me by violet shuffling and the suit on my left side spinning around suddenly, fear gripping me tightly enough to make my heart pound incessantly in my chest, I only caught a glimpse of something from before me. Perhaps someone could figure out what happened, because there would be some evidence of the encounter, when I was suddenly confronted with that horrific sight, an unholy combination of mangled flesh and protruding skeletal remains that still smelled like freshly decomposing flesh. It became unbelievably clear to me why those truckers seemed reluctant to share information from the warehouse. In an attempt I started to slowly back away, ignoring my heart's constant hammering against my ribcage, and silently prayed that this hideous spectre wouldn't notice me. I stood there in terror, unsure of what to do, as the hideous figure lunged at me, but in a flash of instinct, I was able to avoid the lunging monstrosity. Though I knew I had little chance of outrunning this creature, I was unwilling to give up just yet. In my desperate escape, I spotted an old abandoned warehouse nearby, figuring that hiding would be my best option. I was running through the abandoned lot as fast as my legs would carry me, and I could hear it chasing after me, its heavy breathing and grunts echoing through the night. My desperate run came to an end when I discovered what appeared to be a makeshift lab. Scientific diagrams were tacked all over the walls, and hastily written notes were scattered across the countertops. The stench of decay was so overpowering that, in addition to a plethora of surgical instruments, and it took me a moment to piece together what must have happened, someone had been conducting unholy experiments on these bodies before carelessly disposing of their mutilated remains around town. As soon as the implications of this revelation set in, I started desperately looking for any clue as to who might have committed such unthinkable atrocities. There were extensively annotated anatomy books lying around, and human body parts preserved in jars. I found a leather-bound journal buried under heaps of trash and papers in the lab's corner. I wasn't sure if it would hold answers or more horrors, but I couldn't help but be curious about this twisted place and its creator, so I carefully opened the yellow pages. The entries started 6 months ago, when Dr. Robert Hanover, a highly qualified, after being fired from his position for unknown reasons, he forensically pursued his goal of creating a monstrous creature out of the body parts he had been collecting. However, as time went on, it seemed that his experiments had begun to impact not only the bodies he had been working on, but also his own mind, fueled by a burning desire for vengeance against those who had expelled him. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting and smudged with various unidentifiable stains, described Dr. Hanover's final attempt to create the ultimate monster, using himself as the final test subject. He must have transformed himself into this unholy combination of man and beast. Dr. Hanover started losing control over his thoughts and emotions, plunging down a rabbit hole of madness. I realized as I put down the journal that I was in Dr. Hanover's lab, and that the creature pursuing me was none other than Hanover's ultimate creation, a hideous fusion of the evil that grew out of mutilating procedures and the remnants of sanity. Scuffling noises warned me that it all rather. Dr. Hanover himself was nearby, and at that moment I noticed a gasoline container on one of the work tables. An earth-shattering explosion vaporized any trace of Dr. Robert Hanover and his macabre creations within those warehouse walls, as I hurried back to my truck as quickly as I could manage, praying that Hanover wouldn't discover me before I finished. I knew that this might be my only chance, so I quickly doused the lab in gas. This terrifying revelation made me realize that some dark corners of reality best left undisturbed, lest they unleash horrors from which even the bravest among us cannot escape unscathed. However, the events of that night haunted me 4 years to come, because they also taught me not to let go of the gruesome spectre that not only avoided death, but also would haunt future generations if left unchecked. It was a surprisingly cold evening for April, the kind of cold that makes you wonder if summer will ever arrive. My name is Dexter Callahan, and I work as a truck driver, one of those long-haul guys who spends more time on the road than with his family, just to accept the existence of such horrors, but to acknowledge the tragedy of those who have fallen prey to their own demons. On that particular night, I found myself driving through a remote area of Nevada with nothing but desert 4 miles on either side. I pulled into a small gas station for a much-needed break. It was old and worn down, but it had character, the sort of mom and pop establishment that made you remember simpler times. Their family has been driving for 20 years, and every day is still an adventure. After getting a coffee, I went outside to stretch my legs when an elderly man named Jet greeted me and said, "Hey there, son." He then went on to tell me that he owned that gas station. We started talking, and it turned out that Yep was an amazing storyteller who could use his words to create vivid images, making his tales come to life. One of Jeb's stories stood out in when Yep described Vincent Krause's unnerving physical appearance, tall and lanky, with long black hair matted together like dredged seaweed and a smile that seemed to curl unnaturally. It drowned out my laughter. In particular, it was about an alleged killer, Vincent Cross, who once terrorized this very stretch of wasteland decades ago. Vincent would stalk on suspect travelers and killed them in unspeakable ways, only limited by his twisted imagination. As I finished my coffee and bid Yep farewell, I couldn't help but feel a little amused, but uneasy about Vincent Krause's story, which was undoubtedly just another tall tale folklore created by locals to give newcomers a little fright. With a shake of my head, I got back into my truck and drove away again. This time with the restroom in my truck malfunctioned, I made the decision to spend the night at a rest area. As the night wore on and I got ready to sleep in my truck, I saw that someone had pulled up close by. Their car looked old and beat up, and I was surprised that it could have traveled hundreds of miles across the desert. Out of curiosity, I closed my curtains and looked out to see the driver. The sight sent a chill down my spine. That was unrelated to the temperature. He was tall and lanky, with hair matted together, like blackened seaweed. His wicked smile made me uncontrollably shrink back, as though my tired mind was playing tricks on me. I pushed the image out of my mind and went to bed, but sleep eluded me because an icy trickle of dread lingered deep inside of me during those dark hours of uncertainty every night. I held my breath when I heard a bump or a creep outside. It was then that I realized Jeb's words had stuck in my head even more firmly than I had first believed. Just as dawn started painting the sky in pastel hues, a strange whimpering cry Rose appeared outside, close enough to send adrenaline rushing through my veins to make me fear that if I waited any longer, my curiosity would be smothered by fear. Mustered up the courage to investigate the nightmare before me, which made every drop of blood freeze in terror. Bloody remnants of something or someone that had been mutilated beyond recognition were scattered across the ground, and there he stood in the middle of this horrific scene, none other than that eerie, tall, smirking figure that was still holding dripping claws, indicating that he had done far worse than kill his latest unfortunate victim. As my eyes met his, every shred of bravery turned to fear for what seemed to be the impending doom. I started to slowly back away, trying to make as little noise as possible to ward off the bloodthirsty killer's advances. Thoughts of escape flooded my agitated mind, but all route seemed impossible, as if fixated on the monstrous apparition's mere presence. I couldn't deny that Vincent Krause's twisted imagination held me captive as if possessed by the desert legend himself, but even terror has its limits. Suddenly, the dangerous game between prey and predator began, and every movement I made was met with a chilling grin or haunting cackle. I prepared to make my final stand against the gruesome entity, who was posing as the tall and lanky Vincent Krause, out of pure survival instinct. But I knew that my chances were slim, and that my only chance was to surprise him by taking an unexpected action. I mustered all of my remaining courage and charged toward him with a guttural scream that rose from the depths of my soul. He was momentarily shocked when he looked up at me, so I jumped up and swung my arm or a wild right hook at his twisted smirk. When my fist hit his face, something broke off from underneath it like a tiny piece of machinery. Startled by this strange event, I scurried away from Vincent as he screamed in agony and fell to his knees. As I picked up the broken piece of him, it occurred to me that maybe he wasn't as Vincent writhed in agony on the ground. I decided to investigate further and discovered that he was not human at all, but rather a mechanical monstrosity with a variety of lifelike features applied on top. I tore off his hideous exterior to reveal metal plating, gears and odd technology underneath, a brilliant but twisted piece of engineering intended to frighten and kill. I realized then that Vincent Krause was not the long-dead serial killer that Jab had darkly described. Rather, he was the product of someone who had too much free time and too many twisted ideas racing through their head. They had created these wicked legends using their machines and robotics, then unleashed them on gullible people who dared to venture too far into Nevada's barren wastes. As for the person who created this hideous device, a story of its own started to surface. It turned out to be none other than Yep, the former owner of the gas station who had been entertaining me with terrifying tales just hours before. Maybe he felt a sick sense of irony as he used these miserable machines to share his terrible creations with the world, making them seem even more real through panic and fear. Gathering what was left of my wits, I knowing how many more of these monstrosities were lurking in the desert, waiting to strike, I decided that I couldn't allow Yep to continue wreaking havoc on gullible travelers. I embarked on a mission to make sure that this nightmare would never claim any more lives. After extensive research that took me through secret workshops and several encounters with Jeb's sinister creations, I was able to track Yep down to a remote compound on the outskirts of a forgotten. The sun was low in the sky when I arrived at Jeb's compound, hiding my approach with shadowy darkness. Adrenaline was pumping through my veins, but even though victory would be difficult to achieve and nights would haunt me for years to come, I knew that town confrontation was inevitable and that it was time for me to put an end to this terrifying chapter of my life once and for all. Vincent Krause may have been merely a mechanical stand-in for a human evil, but his presence served as a reminder to me that true evil was within all of us, just waiting for someone who was willing to bring it into the world. As a result, I wouldn't hesitate to take any necessary action to bring justice to Yep and those who had suffered at his hands, even if it meant I was driving down Route 25 in Mississippi not so long ago, blasting some classic rock through the speakers of my rig and feeling the vibrations in my bones as I vowed to rid this nightmare wasteland of its terrors, one terrifying machine at a time, ending the twisted games created from one man's mind. Walking down a dark path myself, the line between hero and villain blurred as I vowed to do so. My name is Austin Pike, and I've been driving trucks for about 15 years. As much as I've travelled, you get a little bored and occasionally stop at truck stops to share stories by the grill while you wait for your food. You've probably heard stories about crazy ones, aliens, ghosts, and other such things, but let me tell you about scarred Marcellus. So I stopped at this small diner off somehow. This diner had surprisingly good burgers, juicy patties with all the fixings piled high. One day, it was getting dark outside and I needed a break. An older couple sitting next to me at the counter couldn't stop talking about the recent string of vicious animal attacks in nearby woods. It's not unusual to come across sickos who hurt animals for kicks, but something about their description made my skin crawl. I felt as though someone had planted a tiny seed in my brain, and it immediately took root while I was chewing my supper and listening to the conversation next to me. Later that night, while I was making my delivery, I began to hear noises that gave me the uncanny feeling that I was being watched. Every crunch of gravel beneath my tires sent a chill down my spine. Now, look, I'm skeptical just like around an old bend in the road. There stood a haggard woman with graying hair sticking out at knife-like angles from her head. Her clothes were ripped and filthy, but her face looked like a wax figure left out in the dark. I don't believe in ghost stories or local legends very easily, but something felt strange that night that was more real than just some wild imagination or misplaced fear of the dark. When I realized that this must be scarred Marcellus, the woman who had been responsible for all the recent attacks, I realized that half of the sun had simply vanished and replaced it with a twisted, grotesque mass of scars and tissue. Her hands had been fashioned into long, slicing claws with bone and sinew protruding for lethal effect, and she lunged at me with alarming speed for someone who appeared to be barely able to walk. I abruptly swerved to the side of the road and leapt out of my rig, wishing I had a weapon of some sort with me. The fear was overwhelming me now, and Marcellus leapt onto my rig with unexpected grace, letting out an unholy screech that sounded like 70 pounds of scrap metal being gnawed up by chainsaws. It's hard to describe that with her other hand, if you can call it that. She sliced through the hinges, holding my truck together before jumping onto the ground next to me, her jaw stretching impossibly wide in a bloody grin. I knew I was in for the fight of my life, and every ounce of adrenaline in my veins jumped as we traded blows with her. There was a sickening crunch sound that filled the air as she tore into the metal and wiring of my truck, tearing it apart in a way I never thought possible. Hellish claws against my fists and feet, blood all over the place, some mine, some hers. I could feel my body deteriorating as we carried on with this deadly dance, and I knew I had to finish it before Marcellus cut my jugular. I threw her to the ground, briefly disarming her, and I screamed at Marcellus in a voice that barely sounded like mine, and she rasped out some terrifying words. Marcellus is the name of my daughter who they killed. As she wheezed out those words, everything began to make sense in a twisted way. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Who are you?" Transformed her into this hideous being, a shadow of her former self, seeking revenge on anyone who came into contact with her. However, the question of who killed her daughter was still unanswered at that time, as a memory of an incident that happened in the area years ago. A group of reckless and inebriated teenagers killed a young girl one night on Route 25, but they were never prosecuted because Marcellus listened to me and said, "Killing innocent people won't bring your daughter back. You have to focus your rage on those who deserve it." For a moment, she hesitated long enough for me to free myself from her hold, and as I stumbled to my feet, I saw one of those monsters hiding behind a gate. Their powerful families in the community were horribly affected. For a split second, I saw something that appeared to be recognition and twisted maternal pain in her remaining eye. Then, with an unearthly roar, she lunged after him, leaving me behind. Tree, an actual perpetrator in Marcellus's daughter's murder, had been watching our gory exchange while laughing and cheering for blood. Even though it wasn't a perfect ending, it seemed appropriate given the twisted consequences of grief and vengeance. As I put miles between myself and that night of terror, I couldn't help but think about how our choices can come back to haunt us. I somehow managed to get back into my mangled rig and drive away as far and fast as my battered body would allow. Me, recalling scarred Marcellus and the terrible events that transpired as a result of decisions made years ago by influential people without any accountability, made me realize that secrets would always resurface, and this was one tale that would endure on Route 25 long after everything else had been forgotten or put to rest. Work was slow as usual this time of year, and we were in the middle of those unbearably hot days where it seems like the air is melting all around you. I had just returned from a delivery run to a remote town called Rinky Dink, and I felt fortunate that my truck's air conditioner hadn't failed me on the way. As I was taking a brief break and drinking a lukewarm Coke, my boss called. "I've got an emergency pickup for you," Zakarian shouted from across the yard. "We're short-staffed, and you finished your route early." I shrug, muttered a joke about how emergencies happen in this line of work, and got back in my truck to head out. The coordinates led me to a remote area close to Kelso, Washington, which isn't exactly prime vacation territory. A man and a woman about my age were already there when I got to the location, and they appeared to be arguing over a scratched wooden box on the ground next to them. I apologized for disturbing them, but I called out, "I'm here for the pickup." It took them a moment to stop, and then they both introduced themselves as if nothing had been wrong. After the introductions, Lana Caslow, whose green eyes flashed as she drew herself up to her modest height with an iron straight posture, became quite chatty and began talking about how this piece of land had been in her family for generations, and how local law claimed it held something special. Nolan Finnegan was a tall, stocky man with short, dark hair and eyes that almost reminded me of a shark's gaze. Beneath its soil, dark and sinister, Nolan laughed at her remarks, his deep voice brimming with skepticism. As for me, all I wanted was to finish this pickup and get the hell out of there. But all of a sudden, we heard an eerie guttural growl coming from the thickets behind us. The three of us froze, then slowly turned to see a tremendously distorted flash ride beneath the thin layer of mangy fur that clung to it like cobwebs. But what was most unsettling were the creature's eyes, or rather, the absence of them, because they stood on its haunches like some monstrous hybrid of man and beast, with long, sinewy limbs supporting an emaciated frame that seemed to hold together only by sheer willpower. We watched in horror as the creature started to pull something from one of its many scabby pouches. At first, it looked like the viciously mangled carcass of some poor animal, but then shock turned to sheer horror as we realized that it was not just any animal, but a mutilated one. Lana barely managed to choke out a cry as we watched. Despite my fear and disgust, I was able to grab the wooden box as we ran back toward the truck. The grotesque creature was pursuing us, and as we ran toward what we hoped would be safety, Nolan let out a ragged breath before barking at Lana and me. "We've got to run now." I couldn't help but wonder if this was the sinister secret hidden within Lana's family land. Lana screamed out a phrase her grandmother had taught her to use in case of extreme danger, but she never really previously. I had faith in its power. As I frantically rushed forward, my heart grew louder and louder, threatening to explode under the increasing pressure. Then, as suddenly as this nightmare started, it ended. We skidded to a stop at the safety of my truck, and the creature appeared to vanish back into the shadows from whence it originated. The three of us exchanged panting. We started our desperate search for answers by searching the internet and old newspapers for any clue of what we'd encountered. Lana's stories about her family seemed like a good place to start. Terrified looks somehow still alive despite our ordeal. We need to figure out what we're dealing with if we want to stay that way. Lana gasped out between breaths, and so were shaking hands and racing hearts. She informed us that their land had been cloaked in secrecy for decades, with rumors of illicit practices and sinister transactions dating back generations. Occasionally, people would disappear in the area, but none of the cases were ever solved. As we learned more about Lana's family history, we couldn't help but discover that every few generations there had been a family member who, on the third day of our investigation, we finally discovered something tangible. A distant relative of Lana's had written a letter to someone shortly before his disappearance, mentioning an old family curse that bound them to a dark creature. They vanished without a trace, as if they simply vanished into thin air. This chilling pattern raised even more questions for us. The letter explained that when Moside appeared, there were only two ways to make it go, either by offering a human sacrifice or by chanting the phrase that had been passed down through the generations. Lana screamed this chant. Moside was described as an entity that Lana's ancestors had brought forth from a dark dimension in exchange for wealth and power. With this information weighing heavily on our minds during our escape, we decided it was time to confront Nolan. We weren't sure he had anything to do with Lana's family curse or Moside's, but his persistent skepticism and contempt made him the prime suspect. On Wednesday night, we confronted him at his apartment, and as we walked in, Nolan laughed nervously in an attempt to lighten the mood by cracking jokes. Jokes about monsters and curses, but when we told him about Lana's family history and most of her side, he turned pale and revealed something he had been keeping hidden. It turned out that Nolan was a private investigator hired by Lana's cousin to investigate her father's disappearance. It appeared that Lana's family had secrets, even though she was unaware of them. Nolan began to suspect the curse. During his investigation, the three of us realized that we had two options: either confront and destroy most of the creature, or find a way to permanently end the curse. We concluded that the only logical course of action was to return to Lana's ancestors' land and try to banish the creature back to its dark realm without using human sacrifice. However, he didn't fully believe it until he saw most of it with his own eyes. On Thursday, as we stood on the cursed soil, Mosides emerged from the shadows in front of us just as they had days earlier. We mentally and physically prepared ourselves by gathering items that we hoped would protect us from Mosides of vengeful wrath. Late that night, we returned to the land where it all started, our hearts heavy with fear, but determined to protect future generations from this darkness. Though we were prepared this time, we chanted the same words Lana had used when we first saw it, adding new lines about driving out evil creatures that we had discovered in an old book. Our voices somehow sounded in unison, drowning out the guttural growls of Mosides, and the creature began to writhe and thrash in agony, as though our words were tearing it apart in front of our eyes. It then started to shrink. It took us days to fully comprehend what had happened, but in the end, Lana's family curse was broken with sheer courage and determination rather than violence or fear. The three of us left that night not only as survivors, but also as prison breakers, freeing ourselves from the grip of Mosides for any future generations had occurred, but it was obvious that our lives would always be connected. We committed ourselves to assisting others in overcoming the evil that exists in the world, just as we did for ourselves. In an ominous and uncertain future, we stood united as a beacon of hope,